Sex, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the speculative interdimensional vehicle, Sex in Space. Its mission, to explore new points of view, to seek out fresh opinions, to boldly go where so many have gone before, and still somehow manage to totally miss the point. Subscribe to Sex in Space, wherever quality podcasts are found.
Okay, so with us today in Sex in Space Studios is Dr. Jenn, who is a very serious sexual pioneer, I'd have to say. And let me just give you a quick bio without embarrassing you, Dr. Jenn, because, you're pretty amazing. Sociologist, so academic, author, intimacy and relationship coach, international speaker across so many forums on desire, sexual consent, healthy relationships, body image, erotic play, effective communication, women's empowerment and mindful intimacy, has presented 2 TEDx talks, given literally hundreds of interviews on the media, and has an educational video series that's a massive hit on YouTube, expert in the documentary on masturbation, which is really cool, by the way, check it out, called Sticky, a self-love story, co-host of the Sex Talk with Clint and the Doc podcast through iHeartRadio, written and hosted video projects with Planned Parenthood, tech editor for Dr. Ruth's 4th edition of her Sex for Dummies book, an active philanthropist, a volunteer, and in her free time, do you actually have any? She plays ukulele, so cool, big out here in the Pacific, has a black belt in karate, oh my God, explores new cultures and plays 2-person beach volleyball in the weekends. Dr. Jenn, incredible human being, welcome. So good to have you here.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. This is delightful. Thank you.
What an incredible bio you have. And such important work you're doing. How did you get into the sex workspace at all? What led you there?
Well, and it was kind of, the quirky how fate sort of happens and intervenes at time. I mean, I live in San Diego now, and I've been here in San Diego, California for 20 years. But I grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania in a small town, and very much was raised a good girl. I was raised Catholic and, follow the rules and be a good girl. And when I was a sophomore in college, so I was about 19 or 20. My roommate became a sexual health peer educator, where you go around to the dorms and do condom demonstrations and safer sex talks. And at the time, this was 1993, I think. So in the US at that time, it was becoming big on college campuses to start to be doing sexual health education around reducing any risk of spreading HIV and AIDS. And so that's, so I ended up joining the group actually because it's sex. So it's interesting. And because I wanted public speaking skills, because I figured if you could get up and you were taught to speak in front of a room about sex, you could probably talk about anything. And I just kept talking about sex. And here we are, 30 plus years later.
Wow.
And I became particularly fascinated about how people make decisions intentionally and not intentionally around sexual encounters, and how so many aspects like fear and shame and gender role socialization and power dynamics interfere with our ability to actually make intentional choices for our own well-being, our mental, physical, emotional, social well-being.
Yeah, those sexual scripts are pretty strong that we obtain through culture. Could you say 30 plus years, which is a big span? What do you recognize as some of the major shifts over that time?
So I would say, over the past 30 years, for sure, there is so much more greater normalization around talking about sexual topics and the need and importance of talking around sexual topics. And between movies and books and streaming shows and social media, there's so much positive community around learning about sexual health and healthy relationships and self-empowerment and self-worth and making good sexual health choices and body positivity and all of these aspects. It's fantastic. Yet at the same time, I think because of technology and social media, I feel like we're worse at like true vulnerability in terms of face to face with other folks. Like, so the depth of like, what I call quote unquote true intimacy, which is really like letting your walls down and being vulnerable and authentic in that really like scary, messy human way, and creating a space for someone else to be able to do the same. Like that is like the most amazing thing we can experience with another human. And it's like super scary, and it feels terrifying inside because we don't want to let our walls down. We want to keep our armor up, and that is definitely a skill. And I feel like there's less of that in today's society overall, and more protection and more divisiveness and more reactivity. And I do think for the younger generations, I think there is greater comfort and knowledge around sexual topics, but I don't think that goes hand in hand with greater ability to be vulnerable, like that real awkwardness face to face with another human and putting ourselves out there that we could be rejected or we could feel judged. In that, because it's easier, we can hide behind our phones. And we went through a global pandemic where we had to be behind technology. So, yeah, that's, one of the major shifts I'm seeing, at least in comparing generational differences.
So within the work that you do in relationship counseling, do you find then that as you work with younger couples, there's a knowledge shift, but not a communication skill shift?
You know what? It's interesting because there is much greater communication around what people are struggling with in their emotions. And for like all genders, there's so much greater like, oh, yes, I got triggered. I got reacted. It was an old trauma of mine. Like using all of this like counseling therapy, mental health languaging, and self-awareness around that, and some greater ownership of it. But I would say the resilience needed to keep showing up and be vulnerable and uncomfortable with somebody, instead of maybe being like, you know what, this isn't working, tap out, let me go try something else because there's a lot out there and I could find somebody on a dating app or something like that. So I think it's vulnerable to keep trying at something that's tough. But there is a fine line, right? Because you don't want to be in something that's abusive or something, that's not going somewhere. But so I think that ability to keep talking through, doing the hard work of talking through topics and speaking to your deepest insecurities and fears, not, as a way of, as a way of truly connecting with another human and giving them the space to do it without being like, oh, I'm just not good at this, I had this past bad experience, or putting some label on yourself and then walking away from it. So I don't know if I'm being clear. Like it's a there's a lot of different directions with this, and
it's very layered, and I think that's really interesting, that language that you identify that they're using, and this is triggering, or I brought this forward because of origin story or whatever, that stuff.
Yeah.
But it's still that difficulty in being vulnerable with another person that's at the seat of it, and
staying with the discomfort. I think that's, if I had to pick one underlying piece, I think it's the ability to stay emotionally uncomfortable without then being like, I got to tap out and do something for self-care, which is like a great awareness to have. But I feel like maybe the pendulum swung too far in the other direction, because if we can't stay and do hard things, we're going to miss out on truly the depth of living a meaningful, connected life that we most want.
I think the doing that work together of finding out how to kind of connect and unpacking some of this stuff, relationship coaching is great. Often you'll find, though, that one in a partnership is more open to this and the other one's a bit more skeptical. What would be your advice for having conversations, trying to invite a partner into this space with you?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, it's also so some, people have different comfort levels with it. People have different beliefs in it, but people also have different skills. And that some of that is just like genetic personality. Some of it's what you learned growing up. Some of it's what you've learned along the way. And some of it is then how much, tough things have you experienced that you have protections up around. So we're all coming in with different skill levels. And so I think that's when I work with couples, it's not unusual that one is much more skilled verbally and with their awareness of their emotions and their patterns than the other person is. And I think acknowledging like that's so you have an advantage, right? This person, their brain's going to work quicker. If they're in a fight with their partner, they're going to be like, "What's going on? Tell me, answer the question." And the other person's like, "I need some time to process here."
Yeah.
So I think it's, figuring out a middle road of where your skills are. And then how do you both, but it still takes two to tango. You both have a responsibility for creating this safe space for each other and showing up in a patient, kind, compassionate version of yourself. So I think that's speaking to, there's always skills to be learned for everybody. A well-lived life, at least from the best of the research, is one where we have the vulnerability and the courage to truly be authentic, and to prioritize a depth and warmth in relationships. And we're not taught how to do that growing up, let alone that each person it's going to be different with. So there is, having like a growth mindset and taking a growth mind that there was always more to be learned. It's quite humbling. I started this work 30 years ago, and I'll be like, struggling with something with my partner, and then I'll be having a coaching session with a couple, and I'll be giving them like, "Oh, why don't you," giving them a piece of homework advice and like a homework suggestion, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's a damn good idea, Gunsaullus. Like, you should take that for yourself. I was like, okay, we're just gonna write that in the margins. Like, I need to do that also. So I mean, it's a lifelong process, and that there was always more skills to be learned about ourselves, to reflecting on what triggers us, what we feel, where we feel it, how to be kinder to ourselves, how to be kinder to others, how to attune to our partner, how to be creative with intimacy in a long-term relationship, and how to meet our partner's needs, even if they don't always make sense to us. So that is just ongoing and is different. We can carry skills from past relationships, but each person, it's going to be organic and there's going to be new things to learn. So to me, it's just having a growth mindset that there's always more to learn and ways to grow.
Yeah, you remind me, I wish I could remember who it was, but of a great talk I watched once about someone, and it's very translatable. They were talking about how we show up in the business world and saying, we tend to behave as if we're always on, we're performing rather than recognizing the need to rehearse. And I think that may be very translatable to sex. That the fact that we need to understand that it's kind of like having a good backhand. If you want one, you've got to practice.
Yes. And you have to be willing to be awkward and make mistakes and like mess up and not feel competent and ask questions and be curious. Yeah. So yes. And that's like, especially if you feel like you're like, oh, I'm supposed to know what I'm doing sexually. Like that all feels so awkward and uncomfortable. But when you can create that space with someone else and laugh and be silly and fart in front of each other and mess up. And, when I tell couples when they're trying something new sexually, I go at the end of that sexual session, high five each other. And you could say, great, we never have to do that again because that sucked. And that's fine. But like celebrate the fact that you had the courage to try something new and be awkward and do that as a team together. Like that is a form of intimacy. Even if the actual sexual intimacy maybe wasn't so great, you still built more trust and emotional intimacy with each other.
Yeah, that's cool. And for those who are, in far-flung parts of the world and can't get to you personally, you've got a lot of online courses. Do you have some that you would recommend for couples, particularly, that they could access of your work?
One of my specialty areas is couples in long-term relationships with mismatched desire levels. And specifically then, since one of my areas is female sexual empowerment, particularly if women are in long-term relationships and are struggling with lower desire and have a partner who has higher desire, and they miss it and they want that connection. And so I do have a course for that. It's designed specifically for women, but when I've talked to couples that have done it together, they have learned so much about each other. And there's a lot of short videos, and there's a lot of practical activities in there. And it's really helpful if the couples can do the activities together, watch the videos, learn. This one couple shared with me, they're like, yeah, her husband was like, wait, like, I was given some sort of like sociological background stuff. He's like, wait, this is like a thing? Like, do you struggle with this? And she's like, yeah, like totally. And my whole life. And he's like, what? Wow. So just that, we live in very different bodies, and we're treated differently in this society. And, and that leads to very different experiences that we don't often have the place to talk about them. And then I have a course on, rewriting our sexual stories, in that, looking at how we have all inherited stories and experiences and meaning and interpretations from our societies, our cultures, our religions, our families of origin. And that's a lot of what I end up doing when I work with adults, is like unpacking all of that, and the shame and the embarrassment and the misinformation and the fears and the insecurities that often that we've inherited in various ways from those around us, and often unwittingly. So, and once we realize, like, oh, these are other people's stories, or this is a story I made up for myself because I was a kid or I was a teenager, or like I didn't know, and I made this to mean that I'm not worthy or I'm not lovable, and to realize, like, that's a story. And that's how our human brains work, that we make stories as a way of making sense of our world around us and ourselves, but that doesn't mean they're empowering for us. And so, and I help folks shine a bright light on that with this Rewriting Your Sexual Stories course. And then they could start rewriting their own stories once you realize that, and be like, oh, yeah, this part of my story, now that I'm like, 45 and looking at that, like, that was totally my 16-year-old brain made that up in the moment. But like, that's not necessarily true. It doesn't have to be true. So, helping folks work through that. And then I have a course that's like a 10-day refresh for couples that just like need a boost in terms of joy and appreciation, and and connecting with each other, and just doing little activities every day just to help give them a little kick in the pants to talk about what's most meaningful and important, and giving activities to be able to connect in that way.
So all of these courses, people can find them through YouTube?
My website's the best place to do it. drjensden.com. Is the place where the hub for all of my stuff. So, yeah.
If anybody out there has a go at any of the courses and would like to talk to us about how that went for them, feel free to get in touch.
Yeah, for sure. Yes.
I think the other point that you make in your work that I've read is that, we're not taught pleasure. So a lot of the time, this is not about kind of being reminded or reskilled or got back up to speed. We just never got that information.
Yeah. Well, and I think, at least looking in U.S. society, at least when I was raised, and so I just turned 51. So particularly, like, we're looking at the 80s and the 90s, like, and this has changed some today, but not completely. Like, if we're to look at like sexual pleasure, like, that was normalized for boys and men, but in a way that is not in sex education for girls and young women. And I think social media has definitely changed that, because there's a lot out there now around pleasure, and the amount of sex toys that are out there, and like great toys that are really designed for vulvas and women's bodies and women's pleasure. But at least in the US, I know we have a funny relationship with just pleasure in general. Like, that it's clearly we're seeking it, but then I don't know. I would rather people more sort of intentionally choose, like, I'm going to take care of myself. I guess I would rather pleasure be more sometimes about like self-nurturing, and look at it in that way instead of as escape.
Right.
And because I think as escape, that's when we're not necessarily making the choices that are best for us in the big picture. Maybe feels pleasurable in the short run, but not the big picture. But when we can intentionally choose it, like, oh yeah, I'm going to choose this for myself, to take care of myself, or to relax, or to connect with others, or to enjoy this meal, and have that intentionality. Because I think the other version of it can be connected to shame or guilt too much, which is the way then the way sexuality gets defined in our society, many societies, that there's like especially around female sexuality, that there's like shame and guilt around feeling pleasure or asking for what brings you pleasure. So is that making sense?
It is. It's sort of conjuring up that kind of the origin story of the US in terms of the Western migration into that space, and that sort of, coming from my part of the world, this sort of puritanical, very religiously structured attitude to pleasure.
Yes. Yeah. And I do think that continues to influence our culture in the US, in that there's something like, I don't know, like, right, that there's something that it's like a guilty pleasure to have pleasure, but like, what is it to fully embrace it and choose it? Because it's fulfilling to you, or it helps you connect with others, or it's a relaxing thing. So I think just in intentionality. I mean, in general, I would love to see more intentionality overall, in people's choice of pleasure, but also in their choice of sexual interactions, of being like, oh, I'm choosing this because this feels good for me. I'm choosing this because I want to connect with another person. I'm choosing this because this just, feels like a fun opportunity in this moment. Um, but then balancing it with the intentionality of the other person, and knowing that someone else has different needs and wants and intentions.
And that sort of takes us nicely into your version, I think, of mindfulness and your book. I know it was in 2019, and it feels like a long time ago when you wrote
Well,
your
I
book.
know, because it was pre-COVID, so yeah.
It's still a very contemporary
Yes.
piece of work,
Yeah.
from madness to mindfulness. Talk to us about your book and what that's about.
Yeah, so it's a lot of what we've been talking about. And so the madness that when I use that term, I'm speaking about how, especially as, if you were in US society, but in many cultures, but yeah, if you are, assigned female at birth, and raised with the expectations of being female in this like female body, and, hormones and menstruation, clitoris, etc., that comes with a lot of messaging around body shame, and right, maybe denial of your own pleasure, or being taught that someone else's needs matter more, not being taught, I remember in Pennsylvania in sex education when I was growing up, like the clitoris was never even part of the anatomy. And it's like, that's pretty important. Like, that I had to learn that I had a clitoris at 18 with my first boyfriend. Like, hey, what are you doing down there? Like, I was like, okay, that feels good. What is that? Like, that's insane. That seems insane to me. I'm an adult woman, and I didn't even know I had that part. Um, so all of that, and that so many women, through religion, through their families, through their cultures, may learn shame around their body and sex. And then you're supposed to be an adult and get married and suddenly flip a switch and have this amazing, passionate, desirous sex life. Like, nothing in our brains work that way. You program the brain one way, you got to deprogram your brain and intentionally bring in new messages. So that's what I call madness. That it's like, how do you expect any women to have happy sex lives as adults? Like, we're like banging our head against the wall. So, and that's where I introduce mindfulness, which is about, being present in the moment and noticing what we're feeling inside, what emotions we're having, where we feel those emotions inside our body, what our interpretations of situations are, what our beliefs are, what stories we're telling ourselves, where did those stories come from, and looking at all of those components of our thoughts and interpretations and emotions and bodily sensations in any one moment around any of these topics, around emotional intimacy, around dating or relationships, around orgasm, around sex. And like, where do you feel triggered? Where do you feel activated? What are you avoiding? What topics do you want to bury your head around? What feels too uncomfortable to talk about? What are you afraid to ask for? Or, if somebody says something to you, what makes you lash out in anger? Like, all of those are triggers that we have because something feels too uncomfortable in that moment. And whether, it's often beliefs tied with the visceral sensations of those emotions. And around sexual topics, we have so much around that. And so that's when I'm teaching mindfulness, like this applied mindfulness as a way of studying our own patterns and societal patterns. And then once we shine a bright light on it, we can learn to sit and stay present with discomfort instead of wanting to run, numb, distract, lash out around it. That's where we can step into our power more. And that's what I call, the epitome of empowerment is to have choices where you didn't have choices before. You didn't know you had choices or didn't have them. And so the more that we can sit with this discomfort around these topics, the more, and we could breathe through it and know that we're okay, then we can make new choices. And then we create new, healthier, happier, more connecting patterns for ourselves, connecting with ourselves and connecting with others.
Absolutely. It's interesting. I feel like there's a very revelatory space in here for men, for heterosexual men, because it's, again, one of those well-kept secrets that this world of mutual pleasure exists. And a framework that I was given by a therapist the other day for kind of penetrative dominant sex, the mainstream view of what sex is it's very much a masturbatory exercise for men. And that stopped me, actually. I had to really kind of sit with that for a bit and go, damn.
Mm-hmm.
And so this kind of crossover space of education of discovery for partners of women, to understand the breadth of what's missing, and unlearn and relearn. There is still, unfortunately, a huge amount of women, let alone men, that still don't understand the clitoris as an organ.
I know. Well, and women, frankly, like I literally have my little, my my little clitoris with the bulbs and the legs and stuff, because you never know when you need it for educational purposes. But the whole, speaking to what you just said, that it's for many heterosexual men that sex can be like a masturbatory experience, right? They have a hole, and they're getting off. And I think that again speaks to like a lack of nuance around sex education. And that since, porn is so easily accessible, and pornography is so visceral when you watch it, like you could be told this isn't what sex really is, but it's still real people having actual sexual activities. And so it's hard not to then think like, oh, I don't know what to do. Nobody's told me the details of what to do, or how you enjoy it, or how you please someone else. This looks like both people are enjoying this. I guess this is what we do.
Yeah.
So,
well, and unfortunately, we just wrote a book about how to talk with your kids about porn. And, very cute, lots of aliens and very accessible.
That's awesome.
But sadly, the majority of sex education for young people today is through them seeking it through porn, because they're not getting what they need at school, and they're not getting what they need at home. And I guess that sort of takes us back to, how do we do this work? And for the future generations of young women, what does this look like? So do you work with parents specifically to talk about how to create a healthy environment and to educate well about sex with our kids?
I have done some workshops on that before. The way it tends to come up more, though, is at the end of a talk I've given to like couples, or when I'm working with clients. And if they have teen kids, like, and folks tend to start asking maybe around age 10 or 11, up through teenagers and going to college. It comes up in those contexts when I'm working with the couples already for their relationships, and then something will come up with their kids, and then I will speak to them. I was like, have you broached these topics? What are you doing intentionally to create a trusting, shame-free, non-judgmental environment for your kids to come ask you questions. And what shows are you watching together? How can you use that for teaching moments? What topics can you bring up in the car where they can't escape you? And you can say, hey, we only got 10 more minutes to go. I know this is uncomfortable for you. It's uncomfortable for me, but I love you so much. I'm going to be uncomfortable for you. Let's talk about this. And that starts at such a young age, 8 and younger, to create that safe space. And normalize, this can feel awkward, or people in society can be weird about this, but that doesn't mean we can't talk about this. So, so the way it comes up for me, like occasionally I am hired to do some workshops around it, but it's specifically around helping parents work on their own baggage and their own shit that they're bringing to the table and unwittingly passing on or creating not a safe space and non-shaming space for their kids. So that's kind of the angle that I do it. And then I give them a bunch of resources, age-appropriate resources, and all different, around emotions and sex and sexual health and friendships and consent and all sorts of stuff. So, but it's usually more sort of roundabout. It's not one of my specialty areas, but I occasionally am asked to speak on it. So
one of the recent conversations I had around consent, which I found really helpful and useful with kids, is it starts with everyday life, and it's about who gets to use the TV remote.
Yes, that's good. I like when folks if they have pets, if they have cats and dogs, I really like that as teaching consent, especially if it's like a 3-year-old. Because I had this parent tell me a story the one time that they're like, yeah, my 7-year-old son came in and was like, Fluffy scratched me. And it's like, well, were you touching Fluffy? Yes. Did Fluffy want to be touched? No. Well, Fluffy put up a boundary for you and told you Fluffy doesn't want to be touched anymore. And
awesome.
And Fluffy probably gave you warnings and was communicating that, and you didn't listen and you pushed through. But then dogs, terrible at teaching consent, because dogs, will unfortunately, sort of take abuse, but dogs want to be loved and, connected. So, but cats are pretty good at teaching consent and boundaries.
Do you have any other kind of tools or ways you suggest into that for adult partnerships to think about?
Yeah, one is just to realize that, anytime you're bringing two humans together, you are very different people and you cannot read each other's minds. And you are coming with a host of different experiences and needs and wants. And that literally can vary by hour, and then for women with our menstrual cycles, and there's so much, and we can't ever assume that the other person wants what we want, is wired the way that we are. And that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with them. And it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with us. It just means we're two truly different entities. And so to have that, again, that growth mindset, to have that curiosity, to have that humility and that willingness to be awkward and ask questions and know that there's so much that you don't know that you don't know. And to be in that space. No, and I'm not saying there's not couples who have been together for a while and you can read each other well and you can feel the nuances and the shifts, and that's lovely when you're in that space. And to stay, attuned to that, and when I've worked with couples before, and when couples start doing that, and then there was this one in particular, like the boyfriend was like, whoa, he goes, something just switched there. Are you okay? Like he sensed it and he called it out in the moment. And because then they had the tools and they had the safety to do that. And she goes, yeah, you're totally right. I just totally got in my head. I think it was like body image something. I don't know what it was. And then instead of either continuing with a not great sexual encounter, or that it has to be like awkward and halt the situation, then they're like, hey, let's just cuddle right now. So you still get to maintain intimacy. You still get to maintain closeness and trust and safety. And you've even enhanced it.
Yeah.
So for me, it's that willingness to call out like those situations. You'd be like, hey, are you okay? Something just felt like it shifted a little. Like you're not making them wrong. You didn't, it doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. It's just, we're complex beings, and there's always so much going on mentally, physically, emotionally, socially, spiritually, the whole thing. So for me, it's that humility, it's that curiosity, it's that willingness to be awkward, and truly coming from a place of compassion. and it, you care that other person is not suffering or struggling. You want them to be having a good time.
Yeah. And even if they say, no, I'm good, then that's great. You checked in.
Yeah. Yeah. You're like, okay, awesome. If there's anything there, cause sometimes you're like, no, I think I'm okay. And then later you're like, oh yeah, I didn't even realize it, but how neat my partner. And then you could talk about it later, so.
Sage advice from Dr. Jenn. And I would strongly recommend anybody listening, check out the website, but also check out the book. I think it's a really good read for a partnership. To understand, because so much of this is work that we all have to do. And, I've met a couple of unicorns in my time that are fully formed, have done it all, and are happy little pixies. But, that's not the rest of us, frankly. And I love your acknowledgement, and it's mine too, because we're in this field, that you go home and you think, oh, yeah, right. I need to do more of that. It's an ongoing thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I was just on a trip in Italy with my boyfriend. We just got off back a couple days ago. And Italy driving is very stressful, at least to me. And he was driving, and it is fast and it's curvy, and it's just like, and I was losing my shit on him. And I was like, you're following too closely, slow down. He's like, well, they're following closely behind me. And I'm like, great. So we're all going to get in a big accident together. Is that what you want? And then I was like, bring it down, Gonzalez. Like, take some deep breath. And the thing is, though, I still feel justified in my level of like safety and risk tolerance. However, I could certainly communicate it better. And then I was, and then I could pause and reflect and then be like, okay, this is definitely a trigger of mine. And then when I say that, he gets triggered, like, what can we do differently here? And coming to him and being like, this dynamic isn't working for either of us. Like, what can we do differently? What can we each own up to? So it is a never ending process.
Wow. Yeah. And I think that's a really important thing and a useful little takeaway for those listening, that if you find yourself in a repeat, if you're on a loop with somebody, I did this, he did that, it feels like we're always doing that. That's a really good point, that, just stop, pause, reflect, pause, don't engage, pause and think about it.
Yeah. And then like, that's a really nice mindfulness moment to be like, okay, what's my story? What emotions am I feeling? Where am I feeling them in? Like what I'm talking about here with like feeling scared and, while being a passenger in a car, like it's very visceral. Where am I feeling that inside of me? And then I could be like, okay, and then what's my responsibility in this? What choices do I have to do something different? Or how can I show up better? How can I communicate better? And that's the only way we get through those stuck things, because otherwise it's to the back and forth, you're triggering each other. And then you build up resentments, and then you build up walls between your connections. So we have to pause, reflect, own it. And communicate from that space with the intent to truly listen and hear our partner through, generous listening with an open heart and the intent to really understand and be curious. That's where then as a team, you can have the creativity then to try something new and create something new.
Yeah. And I love that point, generous listening. That means not being ready with the next thing, not thinking about what your response is, being radically curious about what they're experiencing.
Yeah.
So Dr. Jenn, humbly and respectfully, thank you so much. It's been amazing. And you do incredible work. So tune in to Dr. Jenn, people, because there's a lot for everybody to learn there, I think.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dr. Jenn. Appreciate it.
We really hope you enjoyed today's episode. Before we sign off, we wanted to remind you about our 2 books that we have available, How to Talk with Your Kids About Porn and The Organ Education Forgot. These are both available as downloadable PDFs or in print, and you can head over to sexandspace.com to grab your copy. If you do, not only will you be educating yourself about a very important subject, but you'll also be supporting us and all the work that we do, so we think it's a win-win. If you'd like to support us in other ways, we'd love for you to buy some merch, which is also available on our website. We've got both mugs and t-shirts. As always, thank you so much for listening and being on this journey with us. Until next time, safe travels and see you on the next episode.